Okay, welcome everyone to a deep dive.
Great to be here.
Today, we're going to climb aboard, metaphorically speaking, for a look into the world of Cold War bombers. Really fascinating stuff.
Yeah, we're going to look at what made these aircraft tick, how an expert pilot actually ranks them, and zoom in on one specific type, the Russian Tu-22M Backfire.
And then we'll connect that Backfire story to, well, what the bigger economic picture tells us about Russia's military production right now. It's quite the journey.
It is. And we've got some interesting sources to help us navigate. There's this top 10 Cold War bombers list from a B-52 pilot over at Hushkit. Very opinionated, but insightful.
Okay.
Then there's a Reddit discussion sparked by a photo looking at some specific technical details.
Oh, interesting.
And finally, a pretty detailed economic analysis from the Bank of Finland digging into Russian military production stats.
All right, so the mission today, unpack these sources, figure out what makes a great bomber, according to a pilot at least, to dive into the Tu-22M's history and its current role, and then see how that fits into Russia's defense industry today.
Sound good.
Sounds like a plan. Let's dive in.
Okay, so let's start with that pilot's list. Keith Shaban, B-52 pilot. What were his ground rules?
Right, so he kept it focused, had to be a bomber, obviously, and operational sometime between 47 and 91, the Cold War years.
So no prototypes like the XB-70.
Exactly. And he tried to exclude dedicated fighter bombers, though he admitted, sometimes the line gets a bit fuzzy.
Yeah, I can see that. So what did he think makes a bomber good? What was his checklist?
He laid out a few key things. First, range. Makes sense, right? Gotta reach the target.
Yeah.
Second, weapons load. You get there, you need to actually do something significant, carry a punch.
Right, can't just show up.
Then survivability. Can it actually complete the mission? That means speed, maybe stealth, countermeasures, defensive guns, or, increasingly, standoff capability launching weapons from far away.
So it's a package deal, get there, deliver, survive. Exactly.
Yeah.
He also mentioned versatility. These things are incredibly expensive, so if you can adapt them for other roles, that's a big plus. And linked to that, longevity, getting decades of use out of a design is huge.
Then the last one?
Ah, yes, the all-important cool factor. Because, well, it's Hushkit. Got to look good, too, apparently.
Tuckles. Can't argue with that. He admits it's subjective, which is fair. Did he mention any planes that almost made the top 10 but just missed out?
Yeah, a few interesting ones. The B-36 Peacemaker, huge, but slow. Bit of a fire hazard, short career, really. Some of the British V-bombers, like the Victor and Valiant, great planes. But their time purely as bombers was relatively short before they became tankers or recon platforms.
Okay.
The B-58 Hustler, super fast, Mach 2, incredibly dangerous and a maintenance nightmare.
Yeah, I've heard that.
And the original Tu-22, the Backfire's predecessor.
Yeah.
Well, let's just say it had a reputation for being more dangerous to its own crews than the enemy. We'll probably touch on that more later.
Oof. Okay, noted. Let's get to the list then. Number 10.
Kicking off the top 10, he picked the Boeing B-47 Stratojet.
Ah, the Stratojet. Heard that one.
He called it groundbreaking. Really laid the foundation for the B-52 that followed. It was vital early on, and the recon and electronic warfare versions flew for a long time after the bomber role ended.
Versatile in.
Very. And a fun fact, he mentioned it never really got a catchy nickname like other U.S. planes, just Stratojet. Cool factor. Those wild JATO rocket takeoffs.
Oh, yeah. Definitely cool. Okay, number 9?
Number 9 is the English Electric Canberra. Maybe a bit of a surprise for some.
Possibly. Why the Canberra?
Just incredible success and longevity. Flew with the RAF for 55 years. Plus, is built under license in the U.S. as the B-57, exported all over. Not the fastest, but its service ceiling was really high for its time. Only the U-2 flew higher initially.
55 years is impressive service. All right, let's crank up the speed. The Supersonic Club.
Yeah, and it's a pretty exclusive club. Only 4 countries actually fielded supersonic jet bombers during the Cold War.
And number 7 is?
The French Mirage IV. Makes the list partly just for being in that club. And, you gotta admit, it looked amazing, that Delta wing.
It did look sharp. What were its specs?
Mach 2.2 capable. Served France as a strategic bomber for 42 years. Its main downside, though, was its size and range. Relatively small, short legs.
Oh,
Meaning, as the pilot suggested, its main wartime mission might realistically have been a one-way trip. Still, built a wing, JATO capable, supersonic, French, high cool factor.
Fair enough. Okay, now on to some Soviet muscle. Number 8, the Tupolev Tu-22M Backfire.
The Backfire. Yeah, this came about in the early 70s. It wasn't just an upgrade of the original Tu-22. It was pretty much a whole new design to fix all those problems the first one had.
What was its niche? It wasn't quite like the B-1, was it?
No, it's an interesting size, kind of sits between something like an FB-111 and the B-1.
Yeah.
Seems it was really geared towards the European theater and, crucially, as a naval strike plane, a serious anti-carrier threat.
And it's still flying today.
Oh, yeah. Still a core part of Russia's long-range aviation. Roughly 150 or so, still active, apparently. It's seen action in Afghanistan, Georgia, Syria, and now Ukraine.
Any notable vulnerabilities mentioned?
Well, the pilot source mentioned one was lost in the conflict with Georgia, probably shot down by an SA-11 SAM system, which is, a Russian system itself. Highlights the dangers. Cool factor. Variable geometry wings, swing wings.
Swing wings are always cool. Now, speaking of the Backfire, you mentioned that Reddit source discussing engine flames. What was that about? Blue burners.
Ah, yes, that was fascinating. People online noticed that jets like the Tu-22M, and especially the bigger Tu-160, often have this really distinct blue flame coming out when the afterburners are lit. Very different from the usual yellow or orange you see on, say, American jets.
Okay, so what was the theory? Special fuel.
That was one idea, floated some kind of exotic fuel additive. Yeah. Another slightly alarming theory was that the metal of the engine itself was burning.
Yikes. Hopefully not that one. What's the more likely explanation?
The consensus, based on folks with more technical knowledge, seems to be about two things. Really, really high temperatures coming out of the main engine turbine section, like over 1600 Celsius, potentially.
Wow, that's hot.
Yeah. And then a very lean fuel-to-air mixture in the afterburner itself. Less fuel, more air compared to some other designs.
Okay, high temps, lean mix. Why blue?
Well, the intense heat means combustion is much more complete, and a leaner mixture means way less soot gets produced. Soot particles glow yellow-orange. That's the black body radiation you normally see dominating the flame color.
So less soot means you don't get that yellow overpowering everything.
Exactly. With minimal soot, you're actually seeing the natural blue chemiluminescence, the light emitted by the chemical reactions of the kerosene fuel burning really efficiently. So it's not some magic fuel, just a consequence of super hot, clean combustion in those specific engines.
That makes a lot of sense. Very cool detail. Okay, back to the top 10. Number 6.
Number 6 is another Tupolev. The Tu-16 Badger, or the Chinese version, the ZNH-6.
The Badger. What was its claim to fame?
Basically, solid, dependable, and incredibly long-lived. The pilot called it a generic design, but in a good way. It served Russia for like 4 decades. Yeah. And amazingly, the Chinese H-6 version is still flying today, a mainstay of their bomber force.
Still? Wow. What kept it relevant?
Versatility again. It did everything: strategic bombing, missile carrier, maritime patrol, EW, recon. And even today, the Chinese H-6, armed with modern cruise missiles, is a serious long-range threat. It doesn't need to get close.
And it's a cool factor.
The engine's mounted right in the wing roots. Looks distinctive, though the pilot dryly noted they don't build them that way anymore, for good reason.
Okay, let's jump ahead to number 4, another massive Tupolev. The Tu-160 Blackjack, or White Swan, as the Russians call it.
Yeah, this one definitely looks the part. Very similar visually to the B-1 Lancer.
But designed for a different job.
Primarily, yes. While the B-1 eventually focused on low-level penetration, the Tu-160 was conceived mainly as a standoff missile carrier, launching cruise missiles from a distance.
How does it compare to the B-1 on paper?
It actually beats the B-1 on pure speed and range. The B-1 carries a bigger payload, though. The Tu-160 typically carries like 12 long-range cruise missiles or maybe 24 shorter-range ones.
Were there many built?
Relatively few, actually. The pilot source mentioned only about 16 in service at the time. Yeah. Like the Backfire, its cool factor comes from those big variable geometry wings.
All right, let's backtrack slightly to number 5, a real icon. The Avro Vulcan.
Ah, the Vulcan. Just stunning. The pilot basically said if it was just on looks, it'd be number 1 or 2. That massive delta wing.
Unmistakable. What else did it have going for it?
A pretty good mix for its time. Decent speed, surprisingly maneuverable for its size, and a relatively small radar signature. Didn't have the legs or the payload of a B-52, but flying from the UK, it didn't need quite as much range to reach Russia.
And famously used in the Falklands War, right?
Yeah, those incredibly long-range black buck raids. Oh. A real feat of logistics and airmanship. The source adds that grim detail. Only the pilots got ejection seats. The rest of the crew didn't.
Ouch. A sobering reminder. Cool factor is obvious, though.
Just look at it. Enough said, really.
Yeah. Okay, the final 3. Number 3 is?
Number 3, the Rockwell B-1B Lancer.
The bone.
The bone, exactly. The pilot said it was a tough call versus the Tu-160, but the B-1 got the edge because it's seen so much combat action in recent decades, proven itself.
Had a rocky start, though, didn't it?
Oh, yeah, very troubled development. But it matured into a really capable platform. Pilots apparently love flying it incredibly fast down low.
Yeah.
Handles almost like a fighter.
What are its strengths now?
Huge payload, both internal and external. It can loiter for a long time and then make that fast dash in or out. Big drawback, super complex, very high maintenance, cool factor, swing wings, of course.
Variable geometry wins again. Okay, number 2. Getting close.
Number 2 is the Tupolev Tu-95 Bear.
The Bear. Propeller-driven, still flying. How?
That's the thing. The pilot highlighted the Russians stick with what works. And the Bear, designed way back in the early 50s, just keeps working.
Yeah, it's noisy famously. Subs could supposedly hear it underwater. Why stick with turboprops when jets were taking over?
Fuel efficiency. Those massive turboprops with the contra-rotating blades give it incredible range and endurance. Perfect for long patrols or reaching far-off targets without refueling constantly.
But surely vulnerable now.
If it tried to fly right over modern air defenses, absolutely. But that's not the plan. Like the Badger H-6, its modern role is standoff attack. Carry long-range cruise missiles like the KH-55, launch them from over 1,000 miles away. It doesn't need to penetrate. Cool factor. Those iconic, noisy, contra-rotating props.
Definitely distinctive. All right, the number 1 spot, no prizes for guessing.
Yeah, according to this B-52 pilot, it's undisputed. Number 1, the Boeing B-52 Stratofortress.
The BUFF. Still going strong after, 70 years?
Over 60 years of continuous service when the article was written, and they plan to keep flying them possibly into the 2050s. The pilot joked they were already old when he flew them 25 years prior.
What's the secret to that incredible longevity?
Just a fundamentally brilliant, adaptable design. The pilot called the airframe almost generic in a way that allowed it to be constantly modified for new roles, high altitude, low altitude, cruise missile carrier, maritime patrol, even close air support more recently. It just keeps adapting.
And the performance.
Still impressive. Great mix of range, a huge payload, like 50,000 pounds internally, and long endurance. Like the Bear, it's not going to fly into dense, modern SAM networks, but as a missile truck, it's unparalleled. Cool factor, 8 engines. Just pure unadulterated power.
8 engines hanging off those wings. Iconic. What a fantastic list. Really covers the spectrum. Okay, let's zero in now on one of those, the Tu-22 family, drawing from that air vector source. We need to understand the original blinder to appreciate the Backfire.
Right, so the Tu-22 blinder started development in the 1950s as a medium bomber, went through a couple of design iterations. One key feature that emerged was the main landing gear retracting into pods under the wings, made for a cleaner wing.
But you mentioned it had problems.
Big problems.
Yeah.
Early prototypes and production models had serious issues. Engine failures, crashes. The second prototype went down, killed the crew. Not a smooth start. It first showed up publicly in '61.
What were its main design points? Engines on the tail?
Yeah, 2 engines and pods mounted high on the tail fin, swept wings, internal bomb bay, or it could carry that big KH-22 anti-ship missile semi-recessed underneath that was the Tu-22K variant. And it had a radar-guided tail turret for defense.
And the crew safety issue you alluded to earlier?
Yeah, that was maybe its biggest flaw. The 3 crew navigator, pilot, gunner sat on downward-firing ejection seats.
Downward. That sounds bad.
It was. You needed to be at a decent altitude, maybe 800 feet or more, for them to work safely. If something went wrong low down, it was often fatal. And weirdly, getting in and out of the plane normally involved using those same hatches and seats. Just awkward and dangerous.
How bad was the accident rate?
Really bad. Over 70 aircraft lost, which was something like a 20% loss rate over its career. On top of the ejection seats, the KH-22 missile fuel was toxic stuff. Needed special handling suits. And maintenance was tough. Planes sat high, needed scaffolding, engines hard to reach.
And the nickname, booze carrier.
Chuckles.
Yeah.
Yeah, apparently some of its systems used a large amount of pure grain alcohol as coolant or hydraulic fluid or something. And, well, let's just say some of that alcohol didn't always stay in the aircraft systems. Became a sort of perk for the ground crews.
Okay, so a deeply flawed, dangerous aircraft. The Tu-22M Backfire really needed to be a clean sheet then.
Pretty much. The requirement went out for a much better plane, leading to the Tu-22M. The biggest visual change and a key performance improvement was adopting variable geometry wings, the swing wings.
How else did it differ fundamentally from the blinder?
Totally different layout. Engines moved to the fuselage sides near the wing roots with proper variable intakes. Landing gear redesigned, retracting into the fuselage. Bigger bomb bay, more external pylons for weapons bombs or missiles like the improved KH-22M.
And crucially, crew safety.
Much, much better. 4 crew members now, typically 2 by 2, with upward-firing ejection seats. Still not 0-0 capable. You needed some forward speed, but a massive improvement in survivability compared to the downward seats.
That's a relief. What about systems?
Better radar for navigation and bombing, including low-altitude flight modes. A proper suite of electronic countermeasures. And it kept the tail turret, but reports suggest it was often used more for firing chaff and flares defensively than shooting at fighters. It was built mainly as the Tu-22M2 and the improved Tu-22M3, with hundreds produced right up into the early 90s.
Didn't the backfire cause some arguments during the SALT arms control talks?
Oh, absolutely. In the 70s, the U.S. was really worried about its range. Could it hit the U.S. mainland? Was it a strategic bomber? The Soviets insisted it was only medium range.
How did they resolve that?
Bit of a fudge, really. The Soviets agreed to remove the aerial refueling probes from the backfires they'd already built.
Okay.
Everyone kind of knew they could probably be put back on later. But the U.S. also knew the Soviet tanker fleet was pretty small anyway, so the practical ability to use it for intercontinental strikes was limited. It was more of a political compromise to get the treaty signed.
Interesting bit of Cold War maneuvering. Okay, so fast forward to today. The Tu-22M3 is still active, you said, and being used?
Yes, definitely used in the current war in Ukraine, primarily launching those KH-22 or the newer KH-32 missiles from standoff range.
Yeah.
But it has suffered losses.
Like the ones we discussed earlier.
Exactly. There was that confirmed drone strike destruction on the ground at Soltsy Air Base in August 2023. And then the really interesting one, the shoot-down claimed by Ukraine in April 2024, way back over Russia's Stavropol region, 300 kilometers from the border.
And Ukraine claimed they used the same method as they did against those A-50 radar planes. What are we thinking that was?
The strong suspicion, backed up by sources like the UK MOD assessment, is that they used an S-200 surface-to-air missile system.
An S-200? But isn't that ancient Soviet tech? Ukraine retired them, didn't they?
That's what makes it remarkable. Yes, it's an old system, reportedly retired around 2013, but it seems they brought some back into service. The missile itself is huge, like 35 feet long.
And the range? 300 kilometers.
Later versions of the S-200 did have a claimed maximum range around that mark. The huge question, though, is targeting and guidance for such an old system at that extreme distance.
How could they possibly guide it accurately that far?
Well, a Ukrainian official actually mentioned getting help from partners to update the guidance system. So it might be an old missile, but potentially with modernized brains, allowing it to engage targets much further and more accurately than originally designed. It really highlights the ingenuity being applied, adapting old hardware for new challenges.
Wow. Using revived, potentially upgraded Cold War SAMs to shoot down Cold War-era bombers launching modern missiles, the layers are incredible.
It really is.
Okay, this leads us perfectly into the final part, the economics. How does producing things like the Tu-22M or munitions or tanks fit into Russia's economy today? Let's look at that Bank of Finland analysis.
Right. This BOFIT brief tried to use official Russian statistics from Rostat, their agency, to gauge military production growth since Feb 2022. But as the report points out, Rostat doesn't exactly make it easy.
How do they hide the numbers? Is it classified?
Some is, but mostly it's obscured through categorization. They lump things together, like weapons and ammo might be grouped under other fabricated metal products, or a big company like Ural-Vagonzavod makes both tanks and railway carriages.
So if train production drops because of sanctions, but tank production booms, the overall sector number might look flat.
Precisely. It masks the specific military surge if the civilian side is struggling. You have to tease out the specific subcategories known to be heavily military.
So when the analysts did that, what did they find?
A clear pattern. Rapid growth in those military-heavy subdivisions, especially things like artillery and munitions manufacturing that showed really strong growth.
What about electronics components, crucial for modern gear?
Also significant growth there, particularly in 2023 and carrying into 2024. Same for machine tools, the things you need to build the weapons. That sector grew strongly too.
And the big stuff, aircraft, ships, tanks.
Aerospace had a bit of a dip initially, probably sanctions hitting the civilian side hard, but it recovered strongly in 2023-24. The category covering ships and military combat vehicles, which likely includes tanks and armor, was flat in 2022, surged hugely in 2023, but then showed a decline in early 2024 in ruble terms.
A decline? Does that mean they're running out of steam on tanks?
The report suggests that's possible, but the more likely explanation for that specific 2024 dip is the timing of huge, expensive deliveries. Like, they handed over some big nuclear submarines in 2023, but none in early 2024. Those single items cost so much, they skew the quarterly figures dramatically.
Ah, okay, so maybe not a slowdown, just lumpiness in deliveries. Did the report estimate the overall share of military production in the Russian economy?
Yeah, they tried. Using some reasonable assumptions, they figured the military share within the machine-building part of manufacturing rose from about 31% before the war to over 35% by 2024.
So a definite shift in focus.
Definitely. And interestingly, the fall in civilian output in some areas might have actually helped by freeing up workers and factory space for military production.
What about compared to the whole economy, total industry?
As a slice of total manufacturing, military stuff was estimated at just over 10% in 2024. As a share of all industry, including mining, energy, etc., it was less than 7%.
Less than 7% of total industry. How does that compare historically?
The source made an interesting comparison. Back in 1988, the Soviet military share of total industrial output was around 6.6%. So numerically, it's actually comparable to the late Soviet era.
Wow, but the context is totally different, right?
Completely different. Peacetime adaptation then versus wartime adaptation now.
So the takeaway is Russia has significantly ramped up military production, redirecting resources, even if it's not quite a full-blown WWII-style war economy.
That seems to be the conclusion. The official numbers, tricky as they are, align with other evidence showing more quantity being produced. Sanctions might affect the quality or modernity of some equipment, but output volumes are up significantly. The economy has adapted to sustain the war effort, even if it's not fully mobilized in the classic sense.
This has been incredibly fascinating. We've gone from a pilot ranking iconic bombers like the B-52 based on things like longevity and versatility,
to the specific, often troubled history of the Tu-22 blinder and its much-improved Backfire successor.
seeing how that Backfire is still flying but facing threats from potentially upgraded old tech like the S-200.
And finally, connecting it all to the hard economic data showing a real surge in Russia's defense production today.
It really paints a picture of constant adaptation, doesn't it? Old designs enduring, old systems being repurposed, economies shifting focus.
Absolutely. The lines between past, present, and future tech seem really blurred right now.
Which leaves us with a final thought, perhaps. You see these 1950s designs like the B-52 and Tu-95 potentially flying for a century. You see decades-old SAMs being updated to counter modern threats. You see economies proving surprisingly resilient or adaptable in wartime. Considering all this, how much can the Cold War playbook, the lessons from that era of bomber design and industrial might, really tell us about what future conflicts will look like and what it takes to sustain them?
That's the big question, isn't it? The past is definitely not dead. It seems it's not even past when it comes to military hardware and strategy. A lot to think about.